Hi HR Nation, it's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today we're joined by John Sigmon. John is the Chief HR Officer for the Henry Jackson Foundation for the Advancement of Military Medicine. John, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. John, fill in the gaps. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey to where we are today.
Sure, that's terrific. So I think the most important thing to know about me is that I never set out to be a chief HR officer. I started my career quite a number of years ago, and I started really in investment banking.
Oh, wow.
I was in that field for a number, for a number of years. And then I went to work for the U.S. government in my mid-30s or so, and I was fairly successful doing that for a number of years. One of the things that happened during the course of that time frame was that my boss retired, and they didn't really know what to do with my job. So, like a lot of organizations do, even today, they found a place for me, but they found a place for me in HR. And I'd never been in HR before, and suddenly I was reporting to the head of HR for this large agency. And so that's how I actually got into HR. That was about 20 years ago, and I've never looked back. It's a fascinating career. I love it. And the reason why I love it so much is because it seems to be where most organizations need the most help. And sadly, a lot of them don't even know that, but that's a whole other issue. But yeah, so I love my role. I love working with people. Love helping organizations get better and transform and see new visions and innovate. So that's really what I'm all about. And my journey to being in HR was a little unique, I think.
Mm-hmm. You know, one thing I've realized from doing this show is no one planned to be in HR.
Yeah. I think that's probably a lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
Although I am heartened a little bit because I do get pinged quite often from people who are actually looking to get into HR, and students, people in other professions who are interested in the work that we do, and that really is quite heartening to me.
Yeah. What advice do you give those guys that reach out to you, just out of curiosity? What's your advice to people looking to get into HR?
Yeah, so my advice is to try to start out by being an HR business partner or start out as an HR specialist or generalist so that you can understand the broad breadth of HR and what it involves. So that's kind of an entry-level piece of things. I get a lot of people who contact me who want to know, what does it take to advance? What does it take to become a manager or director? Yep. And my advice, again, is similar, but, have a broad brush, but understand, I like what Dave Ulrich says all the time, HR doesn't exist for its own sake. It exists for the sake of the business. And so that's my advice typically. And from an HR specific piece of advice, I always tell people, understand how compensation works. I mean, look, money is the lifeblood of the capitalist system. And if you understand how compensation works within the HR context, you will be a lot further along than most of your peers and contemporaries.
Perfect. And because the reason I asked that as well is my wife's sister has just started her master's in HR. And I have a mixed feeling about it because I don't know how, for example, I don't know how it works in the US, but obviously we have CIPD. And yes. I spoke to some HR leaders that say they would much rather have someone in that they can teach from the ground upwards than that comes in with a CIPD background because they want to mold them in a way that they feel is 21st century, in their words. Yeah. Is there a route for people to get into HR without going down the college or university route?
Yeah, there absolutely is. And a lot of ways ends up being just how I got into HR, really almost by accident. And I think, the U.S. equivalent is the SPHR and the, sort of the CERM certification. I don't, as a hiring person in HR, I don't see that as a prerequisite. I just see that as, you understand the competencies that, are necessary to be successful. Now I can help you build those competencies within my department. I can rotate you around, which is some things I've done before. I've taken people directly out of school, I rotated them through the various HR departments and kind of settled them in somewhere once they went through this rotational process. So I don't see the certification as a necessary entry point, but at some point in your career, and again, I didn't get certified in HR until 2013 because I never really saw a lot of the value in it. I was successful without that. But then I thought, well, why not? So, again, it's not a prerequisite, I don't think.
Interesting. Because when I first started, it 100% was. And that was a long time ago. But now things just changed.
I noticed that a lot. I noticed that a lot in the UK ads that they look for CIPD.
They do.
It's coming in the door.
100%. You see that everywhere. But more and more now, every time I speak to HR leaders over the last year or so, 2 years, it's being, we don't even really care. Not we don't care, but we look beyond that, because some of the
nice to have.
It's a nice to have, but as you said, you can develop those skills yourself.
Absolutely.
Internally in the business, and there's no better way than learning on the job by doing.
The old 70-20-10 rule, right? 70% of what you learn is on the job, just doing it.
Exactly. Right. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
What would you say is your area of expertise? Of course, you look after all areas of HR and as a generalist, but what would you say is the areas that you're most successful and that you're most passionate about?
Yeah, so there are two things I'm most passionate about, and they're really kind of connected together. So I'll use some HR gobbledygook with you for a second. So one is organizational transformation, right? And so helping organizations, because what happens is over time, people kind of add little pieces here and there to their structures and their organization, et cetera. But they, at the same time, they change strategies. And so a lot of times their function, their form doesn't really meet what their strategy wants. So I'll give you a really prime example. I worked in an organization. We wanted to get to 50 million members by 2020. And if you looked across the organizational structure, you saw brand over here, marketing over there, membership reporting somewhere else, data reporting to yet a fourth place. So if you look at that, I mean, logically, you would say that you're not going to reach your goal the way that you're structured. So that's one piece of it. But from a more practical level and a more kind of human level, what I'm really passionate about is bringing the outside experience that people have on a day-to-day basis inside, right? Just for example, I mean, you think about technology is one example, process is another example. So I could leave the building I'm sitting in now, I could go to an office supply store and I could buy a case of paper, and I could be back to this building in probably 30 minutes or so, depending on traffic. Now, while I'm in this building, try to buy a case of paper in 30 minutes. It's just not going to happen. There are forms to fill out. There are requisitions to do. You have to go into the system. So it's eliminating the bureaucracy so that people's experience outside of their organizations matches the experience that they have inside their organizations. And I think that companies and organizations that recognize this basic fact will be the ones that will win in the future. So we look back in the U.S. at least, and I'm sure all over the globe, we look back at our experiences with labor, like at the turn of the century, and we look back at that in horror. And we say, well, how could we had child labor and all sorts of people burned to death while they were working because the doors were locked, et cetera. And I can guarantee you that in my lifetime, future generations will look back on our current workforce
and think, wow,
how could you have had to, why do you have to do this why do you have to wear this every day? Right.
I know it's why I haven't got one on anymore.
Yeah. So why do you have to punch a time clock? Why do you have to show up at a building? Why did it take so long? Why does your computer weigh 5 pounds when I have one in my pocket? So that's, and if we don't change, so you can tell I'm really very passionate about that. If we don't change as organizations to start to meet that basic human need, we're going to get left behind.
It's very interesting that you say that, because you are right. Whenever you look at the experience from in the workplace to outside, it's like, why are we so slow inside a business, which actually should be even faster, because we're trying to grow an organization, create revenue, build a business.
Right. We just have not evolved fast enough. And the challenge is that out there, the world is evolving exponentially faster than we are inside. And that's a problem.
Yeah. Even something stupid like remember when I used to try and get an expense form done as a manager.
Oh,
an
please.
expense form. I had to fill out an Excel spreadsheet with my expense form, and this is what I spent. And then it had to go to someone else who had to check it to make sure it was fine. I did my expense forms correctly. And then it went on to my manager, who had to check it again. Then it went on to finance. And then if finance were okay with it, then I had to wait 2 weeks to get the expense money back. It's such a silly little small detail that used to drive every manager in the whole company absolutely crazy. But another, if you had that same experience outside, it just wouldn't happen.
No, yeah, I mean, you would never tolerate it. I mean, it's almost as if you feel like when using the one you just described, you feel like saying, well, let me just write you a check for $50 and we'll call it a day.
I would rather do that.
It's just too much hassle to try to get back my $100.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
It's great. So how have you have you sort of coined this terminology? Because I think what you've identified and what you've mentioned to me is something very unique. No one I spoke to has brought this up, but I can see immediately what you're talking about and the impact that will have on the organization. Is that something that do you have a terminology for this, or a phrase of where does this fit into then in terms of the HR role?
Yeah, so I call it bringing the outside in.
Okay, so we've got a name for it. Good.
Yeah, so that's what I call it. And not to paint too broad of a brush, but a lot of it really kind of starts with the technology that people experience. And so in my last organization, I partnered with the chief information officer, and she had created this idea of the workplace of the future. And so when we were done with this, we started with, it was a large building, so we started this outfitting. So when we were done with that, people had they had their choice of tablets, so they weren't issued just a basic laptop. Every employee got their choice of what kind of tablet they wanted. You were connected wirelessly wherever you went. So all of those kinds of things. So again, trying to match that experience that people have outside with the experience they have inside. Because if we don't do that, we don't make those moves, then there's a disconnect. And if you're lucky, people recognize what that disconnect is. But typically what will happen is there'll just be this angst that people have. Why am I, and that creates all sorts of disconnects that people, that we don't want to have. So it starts with the technology, but it also kind of drills down to the more mundane sorts of things like policies.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a real life example. Do I really need a 22-page policy? Now that's over 20 feet of paper. Do I really need a 22-page policy on how to complete a timesheet?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, and it kind of gets all the way down to that level. So, I've created this framework for policies, for example, and it's, the policy has to be legally required, and not just because you tell me it's legally required. You've got to show me the statute, the regulation, the rule that requires me to have this policy. It has to be ethically necessary, and to some extent, it should be employee driven. So even the mundane kinds of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, the last thing I want one of my employees to be telling anyone is, well, we have a policy for that. Engage with people and let them know this is what you need to do. And so I think starting from the basics all the way up to the more expensive kinds of things with technology, I think there are lots and lots of room for lots and lots of opportunity for improvement in that area.
So what advice would you give to other HR leaders then that are in a similar position to yourself that perhaps could utilize some of these methods? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, so here's how I got started on this journey. I looked at myself and I looked at my own experience. And my own experience was that about 10 years ago, I applied for a mortgage, right, in New York State, just to be specific, and I never touched a piece of paper, right? And so, yet when I come into my office, I'm flooded with paper. So that's kind of what started my journey is looking at my own experience, right? So when I pull up my phone, when I'm on a laptop with you, and I'm using Zoom, et cetera, how easy is my life? It's not undifficult, but how easy is my life outside of the work environment, and how does that translate internally? So start with just that list.
Yeah.
I started with the list that included technology, policies, procedures and processes. Why does it take 3 weeks for me to get a stapler? when I can actually go across the street and I can, if I wanted to shell out $6, I could be back in 20 minutes with a stapler. And so again, kind of it runs the range, but I think everything that we do has to be deconstructed, and we have to start looking at it from that perspective. What are the components that it takes to get this work done, and what are the whys? Why do we have a 22-page policy for completing a timesheet?
Yeah, I'm with you.
And so, and just using that as a keen example. I mean, look, policies serve a purpose, just to harp on that for a second, but the reality is that it does create a barrier between me and you. And so as a manager, as a people manager, I want to engage with my team. I want to have conversations with them. I want them to come to me when they have questions. I want to come to them when I have questions. I don't want to be referred to a policy or a handbook, et cetera. And so I think it kind of, and I've got some experience doing that. We went from, in a previous organization I worked for, we went from 163 enterprise policies to 13. So it can be done. It can be done. It is done. And the organization continues to thrive to this day. Maybe or maybe not because of eliminating these policies, but I'll tell you one thing for sure: employees felt less hassled.
Yeah, it's one less thing that people are going to be worried about or concerned about, or even having to pay attention to.
Exactly.
I think it's two things, right? Speed, it increases speed, and it also, people are going to enjoy their work experience, right? So they're going to enjoy going to work and enjoy being in that environment. It's going to have an effect on the culture because people are going to feel more engaged, and they're not run down by mundane tasks that they have to do. Even for me, everything you're saying resonates with me as a manager in my last previous role. I had to do timesheets for my entire team on an Excel spreadsheet and mark down every single hour that they worked and what project they worked on. And it was just crazy. And that was a legacy system that had been around for years. And then another one was our sales commission structure. Even though finance already had all of the commissions for every single one of my teams, I still had to send them my version of that, which took me a whole day, literally a whole day out of my week. Or once a month, I had a whole day dedicated to doing it for all of my team, but they already knew the numbers, but it was just like a triple check to do it. So I was doing it for the sake of doing it, even if I didn't send it, they would then still send the commissions. It was just like a legacy policy that had been there from forever. Why am I doing this?
It's just crazy. So when you think about that, you think about the value that gets sort of trapped in this bureaucratic morass of to your point, the timesheet, again, so that's an hour that you could have been adding value to the organization. That shareholders could be doing much better work. So, my kind of thing is, and don't even get me started on meetings. So there's all of that.
So
there's all of that piece of things.
Meeting for the meeting's sake. We have to meet. And I used to hate meetings for meeting's sake. I used to say to my director, she's Tuesday, I was like, why are we meeting? We've got so much work to do. We know what we're doing. We're meeting for the sake of that. We have this meeting scheduled every week. And I said, unless we have a real, one of the things that I did do after that, I said, look, if we're going to have a meeting, let's actually set a reason for the meeting every time. So we actually have some reason to meet. Because a lot of times you meet up and then you decide, okay, what do we need to talk about? And then you spend half an hour talking about what you think you should be talking about. And then by the time you've done that, the meeting's ended, and it's kind of just a waste of time. It drives me crazy.
Well, here's sort of a simple gauge that I try to use and try to put across the organization. And that is just look around the table and do the math. And so everybody has an hourly rate. And so if we have a meeting, and I'm very fond of saying this, so we had a meeting. That meeting was a $1,200 meeting. Did we generate more than $1,200 worth of value or future value as a result of having this meeting? And if the answer is no, then we're probably not going to have that meeting again. So, again, sort of, and your CFOs will love that. I mean, so it's just a different viewpoint of looking at meetings. It's not, sure, there's a social aspect to it.
Sure.
But do we actually need that? And is it adding some value to the organization?
I think the more you talk about this, the more and more things are coming up in my head. For example, annual reviews, I think, will be another thing that's in the diary. An annual review everyone that I'm speaking to now is sort of says that annual review is very outdated. You know, you should be speaking to your team every day, and your team every day, you know, their needs change throughout the weeks and the months, not once a year. You do an annual review and do a plan for them, and by the time you've done it, their needs have already changed in that period. And that's another thing as well, which is just based on legacy.
It's just something that, you know, it's like timesheets, annual reviews, etc. You know, it's just a part of the things that we have always done.
Yeah, that's how it's supposed to do it. Why? Because everyone else does it that way. But why?
Right.
I think more you ask the why as well. But why? And they go, oh, but then why? And it gets to the point where you're like, actually, I don't know. I don't know why. I've just been told. That's my answer. Because I don't know. I've just been told by my director that's how I got to do it. That was my answer.
It's always been that we've so another kind of example of that is, you know, we've always had job descriptions.
Oh, well, that was the other one in my brain. Why?
Yeah, I mean, so when was the last time you looked at your job description? If you know where your job description is, and, you know, if you did look at it, did it help you do your job? I mean, so no. It's, you know, look, I mean, they serve a little bit of a useful purpose when it comes to compensation, but compensation professionals don't use a job description. They use a little one paragraph profile. And so so if that's good enough for you to find out what my pay should be, why isn't it good enough for anything else? You know, so again, sort of a relic from the past that we continue to carry forward into today because no one's taken the time to analyze it and deconstruct it and ask the questions that you posed, which is, why do we continue to do this when I've got a whole room full of job descriptions?
I've got a good example for you for the job description. So when I went for my interview at 17 for that role, and it said, you know, you had to have a degree. And I didn't have a degree, but I went anyway. And it said you needed, I think it was a year's sales experience. And it had a few other criteria on there, none of which that I met. The only thing that on the job description which I met was you need to be hungry and passionate and resilient and all of the things that they come up with for salespeople. And I thought, yeah, that's me. I'm very competitive, you know, I think I'd do it. And then after the interview with the HR manager and the sales director, they said, you haven't got the job. And I was like, okay. I said, why is that? And they said, well, you don't have the experience, you don't have a degree, etc. And then my response, being very young and naive, was, well, of course I don't. That's why I want a job, so I can get the experience and the year and everything else. And then she looked at me very confused, but you don't have what we've asked for. And I was like, but how do you know that that's what a salesperson needs? I said, well, why don't you give me a job for free? I'll work for free for the whole month. And if you still don't think I meet your criteria, then you can let me go. Because in my mind, at least I was going to get some experience. Yeah. I'd understand what happens. And worst case scenario, then I've got some experience. And I wasn't working anyway. So I didn't really have much to lose. And the sales director actually looked over and said, okay, that's the kind of attitude I want. Because you were just willing already. You were resilient because you was like, I don't care. And then, but the HR manager still was like, yeah, but he hasn't got the experience. And I'm sitting between these two people saying, wait. You need to make your mind up. What HR wants, what HR has written a job spec. And then the sales director saying, no, this is what I want. Even they weren't on the same page of what they were looking for. And, you know, I turned out to be one of the most successful managers in that company. And I was there for 10 years. Wow. So they could have
great story.
They could have skipped on me. And then from that time onwards, I think most people that I hired didn't have, you know, a degree, didn't have sales experience, but I hired on attitude over anything, to be honest. And you know, I had, you know, ex-army people in the team. I had sports athletes. I had people that came in with very competitive, willing to learn and hungry and passionate what they're doing. And none of these requirements that are on there. And I'm seeing more and more now, a lot of the chief HR officers that I'm speaking to, that they're starting to say, you know what, they're getting rid of the whole, you need a degree or you need this, you need that.
Yeah.
So it's very evolved. And I love that loads of companies now are doing the video instead of doing a list of requirements. They're doing a video now,
I love that.
Advertising jobs. And it's the people that are doing that job talking about what they're looking for. So you're hearing from a guy who's doing the job that you're going to apply from in terms of what they think you need to be to do that job. And that's where I see the future.
Yeah, I really like that when you see a hiring manager who has a little video clip and they describe the competencies that are required for the. So and hiring into an organization is really about the competencies that you can either bring to the table or you develop, and those competencies may or may not exist inside of a university degree. And so that, just kind of thinking about it from that perspective. And again, I love the little videos when the hiring manager's on there talking about what it's like to work here, what it's like to work for me, what I'm looking for, what my team's looking for. I think that's terrific. And 2 years from now, that's going to be every job, I think, will have that.
I think 100%. And you have to think about the next generation that's coming through. They're not part of that world where we came from, where that was normal. They're used to seeing a video. They're used to, because everyone now, we're living in a mobile video and audio world. Kids don't even read these days.
Right.
I can tell you, I've got young brothers and sisters and friends that, they live on YouTube, or they live on listening to podcasts and they listen to TED Talks, and that's how they consume now, right? On social media.
Exactly.
They're not looking for a job spec, and you're not gonna attract the right talent that way either, because that's not how they're going to be consuming content. So it's going to be very, very interesting. Even on LinkedIn, right? You see loads of people now on LinkedIn doing videos saying, "I'm looking for these people," and they've got I don't even know how many millions of people that are on LinkedIn, but you've got all of the professionals. A big portion of the talent in the world now are all going to be able to see that. Or you have a job spec on a website somewhere, and unless someone specifically goes on that website and comes across your job spec, you're not going to find that talent.
Yeah, so. It's too there are too many distractions, and so I think having a very pointed 2-minute video that describes your organization, what it's like to work for you, and what it's like to work there. I think that really kind of carries the day.
Big shift in mindset, though, of course.
It is absolutely, yeah.
Especially for the people that are at the top that have been there for a while. These ideas that we're talking about seem pretty obvious to us, but I can imagine many leaders out there going, "What? That's crazy."
Yeah. People, and we're fond of saying that all the time about how hard it is to change. And I think that to some extent that's true, particularly for organizational cultures. But, again, you think about how people exist outside of the work environment, and people change all the time. They get married, they get divorced, they buy a car, they buy a house, kids go to college, they, start new careers, they end careers, et cetera. So people are changing all of the time. And I mean, sure, it may cause some stress or what have you, but it's nothing compared to what you hear people talk about inside the work environment. And so, again, kind of bringing the outside into the work environment where, change, people are much more agile and nimble, and the systems exist to allow people to do the things that we're talking about. I think that's what's going to create organizations that win in the future. And again, this is the expectation, not necessarily from my generation, but from my children. That's what, I have 2 sons. That's what they expect. They don't expect to deal with a lot of bureaucratic
paperwork
nonsense from the 50s, and I had a great boss at one time, and he was from a different era, and he would say to me, "Well, why can't we just make employees move from one office to another, et cetera?" And he'd have something like that. And my favorite saying was, "Because Eisenhower's not president anymore. This isn't the 50s. I mean, we can do it, but should we do that? I mean, should we be treating people that way?" And he would kind of nod. It was kind of hard for him to grasp that. But I think that's a lot of the mentality that we're dealing with in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, we've got to realize now it's the other way around, that the talent has the power. So in the past, it was the organizations that had the power, and it was like, well, we had the power, we decide who we want.
Yeah.
Now, we've seen how it's completely flipped on his head, and the talent now has the power, and organizations are now going, "Oh wow, now we have to change ourselves to actually attract this talent." Whereas before apparently there was an abundance of talent. But I think back then it was just because we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have social media, we didn't have LinkedIn. And now people will realize, wait a minute, I'm not just trapped within this one organization. There's so many opportunities out there. And we've opened up this whole landscape for people. I was the same. I was in the same company for 10 years, from 17 years old, thinking that where I was the best I was ever going to have. And then until I sort of looked outside of the world and go, wow, there are a lot of opportunities out there. And even from a salary perspective, from a compensation perspective, you don't know what else exists. And you become very surprised
Yeah,
when you look outside of what's going on. So
I
very,
think that's very true. Yeah, absolutely.
very interesting. So in terms of HR skills, obviously we're seeing a big shift in the skill set and requirements of a HR leader now, especially with, you know, the impact of technology and the transformation that the HR department is going through at the moment. What skills do you believe HR leaders of the future are going to need, are going to be most important?
Yeah. So I think, you know, we'll set aside the basics, you know, comp and those sorts of things. I think there needs to be, so we've had a lot of emphasis over the last several years on data and data analytics, as we should. But I think going forward, we need to not rely on that. So we need to find the right balance between the art and the science of HR. I think for a long time, we've ignored kind of the science behind things. So we're behind the curve on that. We're catching up with the data analytics, and being able to predict, you know, who can be successful in your organizations based on lots of algorithms and other sorts of things. But I think there's a danger we're going to go too far on that piece and lose that part about human connection. And so I've got some, you know, unstructured data kind of around that, but everywhere I go and everyone I talk to, and I was just recently at an event where we had 12 speakers, right? And every person spoke on they're wildly different topics, but the common thread through all of those little discussions was the human connection, that piece of things. And so I think, you know, having, you know, whether you call it emotional intelligence or whatever you want to call that, is having that piece of things and bringing the humanity back to the workplace where people feel, you know, valued. And again, sort of the experiences they have outside of the office mirror the experiences they have inside the office. So I think outside of the fundamentals, it's making sure that we keep our eye on that balance between the art and the science of HR, which I think is really, really important.
I think you're completely right. There's been a huge hype at the moment around HR technology, you know, predictive, prescriptive, analytics, etc. And they are right. It is every department's gone through its transformation. HR just seems to be playing catch up. You know, originally finance has always been there. It's always been run that way. At one point it wasn't actually, but then it went through its own digital transformation. You saw marketing go through that through their own, and then obviously sales too, completely now data driven. And now it's HR's turn, only naturally. But you are right. Unlike those other areas, you guys have more focus on keeping the human resources. That still needs to be there as well. So I completely agree.
So, I mean, to some extent, it's sort of, you know, using sales as an analogy. I mean, look, you've got to have the data and the numbers and everything else to be an effective salesperson. But the reality is that people buy stuff from other people.
They buy people, yeah.
Yeah, they don't buy things from an Excel spreadsheet, right? And so I think, you know, kind of carrying that forward, you know, making sure that you have, from an HR perspective, make sure that we have the data and the analysis and stuff, you know, behind the scenes, but that we have a human face on that. So I think that we have a lot to learn from our marketing and sales colleagues.
Yeah, definitely. Where you are now in the organization that you're in at the moment, what's one thing about the organization that most excites you? Where do you see the biggest opportunity for improvement in the business you're in at the moment?
Yeah, so I see the biggest opportunity for us is to expand outside of kind of the government realm to some extent. So we focus largely on military medicine within the U.S. Department of Defense. But I think there are lots of applications outside of the military umbrella within academia. So lots of medical centers do research that benefits the military, it benefits military medicine. So I think expanding beyond just the DoD, Department of Defense bubble, I think is really a tremendous opportunity for us. And we also have a great opportunity to do some really good branding sort of work. So when you think about, most people don't think about the Henry Jackson Foundation, so it's not a name brand. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to create HJF as a name brand that people around the globe, because we are a global organization, that people around the globe know who we are and know the valuable work that we do. And we partner with our military counterparts to produce, you know, treatments, vaccines, other kinds of things in the medical realm that benefit primarily the military, but they do have civilian applications. So in our kind of system, a lot of people don't know that the Veterans Administration, the Veterans Healthcare Administration, they pioneered liver transplants. So liver transplants would not be really available to some extent in the civilian population if they hadn't been perfected under kind of the military umbrella. So there's a lot of value there. And I think capitalizing on that value and making sure that people understand what that is a key challenge for us.
So how are you and the team going to help the business get further to that goal? What are some of the things that you're doing?
Well, some of the things we're doing right now are we're focusing a lot on, we're focusing a lot on the customer experience. I was trying to think of the adjective there for a second. So that really is our primary goal. So one of the things that we find is that we're a little bit fragmented along that continuum. So we've not really ever had an external communications vehicle. So we're trying to build that out right now. We have somebody who's new and in charge of our communications department. But my vision would be to create kind of a chief marketing officer role that would encompass brand and the data and all of the marketing associated with that. And marketing's kind of a dirty word in our business.
I know what you mean. No, yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, but that's what it is. And to try to create a cohesive message out to the community so that people in our vicinity know who we are and what we're about. And so we just haven't had that in the past. We've been very internally and insular and internal focused, but we need to break out of that and be much more agile in dealing with the community. So we're making a lot of, our CEO is out and about quite frequently. I'm here with other executives kind of running the day-to-day. And so I think we're well on our way to getting to those goals.
Perfect. It kind of goes along with the point you made earlier, right? You kind of have to move the inside to match the outside world to keep up, you know.
Yeah, and like a lot of organizations, I mean, we're behind. So we've got a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, well, that's it's going to keep you busy. So that's a good thing.
Exactly. That is good.
I don't envy you. Well, look, that leads us quite nicely on to what we call the quick fire round, where I'm going to ask you 5 questions and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
Oh, my goodness. All right.
What was the number one thing that was holding you back from becoming a senior leader within your field?
I think it was largely understanding how the business actually worked. So understanding the financial aspect of how businesses operate.
Fantastic. What's the best piece of business advice that you've ever received?
The best piece of business advice I ever received was from my grandfather, who was a traveling salesperson, and he taught me that you do not have to be mean-spirited to get results.
Great. What's one book do you recommend to our audience, and why?
Well, so right now I've just finished a book called Forged in Crisis, and it highlights 4 key leaders: Ernest Shackleton, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Rachel Carson. And it's like 4 different books. The thing that's great about it is there are leadership lessons that the author gleans from each individual along the way, but they don't beat you over the head with it. So I think it's a fascinating book to read. It's like 4 books in one.
What's the name of the book and the author? Sorry,
it's called Forged in Crisis by Nancy Cohen, Koehn, I believe.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
no problem. And what's one internet resource that you use to increase your own productivity or stay in tune with current events?
So like a lot of people, I rely pretty heavily on LinkedIn. And so I use that to, so I'm really big on social media. So I use LinkedIn. I don't use Twitter quite as much, but LinkedIn is sort of my go-to resource to connect with people, to learn what's going on in the community and around the globe in my profession.
What's the main feature of LinkedIn that you gain value from? Do you use groups or is it individual messaging? What is it? What part of it do you sort of find most useful?
So that's a great question. So normally I use the groups, but I usually just kind of pay close attention to the news feed. and I have, thousands of different connections on there. And so people ping me all the time. I find it a great way to connect with others. And I've gotten a lot of value out of that, meeting with people such as yourself and others.
Yeah.
So it's really great. The connectedness piece is what's really great about it for me.
Fantastic. And lastly, what's one thing about your business that most excites you today?
So I think the research and the scientific advancements that we're making. So we have a large medical facility in Africa. They're doing great work in creating AIDS treatments, Ebola vaccines, other kinds of things. So the things that people don't think about on a day-to-day basis, those are the things that really excite me. Lots and lots of medical advances coming our way. So it's really very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, look, John, you've given us some great actionable advice. So I know our members will be a lot better off for it. So thank you for that. Certainly some things that are going to get our members thinking, and even myself now when I lead the podcast. Give our listeners, if there's one parting piece of guidance that you could give to your peers out there, what would that be?
Yeah. So I would go back to a colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, wrote a book a number of years ago called HR from the Heart. And I'm not promoting that book, but it's, it really touched me in terms of, how HR is the connective tissue really for organizations and helping people connect with one another. We have a lot to offer and we have a lot of value. And so my advice in 2 words would be bold.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us. Guys, make sure you head over to hrleaders.com. There you'll find all the show notes from the episode, everything we're talking about, links to everything that we discussed. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish you all the best until we next speak.
Thank you, Chris. I'll see you soon.